Okay, so I think that has started. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I've chosen as my theme for today's talk the challenges the LGBT plus community face. But first of all, I would like to start by looking at where we've come from. And it's really important to remember the huge progress we have made. As recently as 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-LGBT plus laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet, just 14 years later, in 2013, with the legalization of same-sex marriage, Britain had some of the best laws. Now, that is a phenomenal, extraordinary pace of change. I cannot think of any marginalized, disadvantaged community that has won so many legal reforms in such a short space of time. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all LGBT plus people and straight friends and allies who helped us win those reforms. It's your collective effort that have made a more friendly Britain possible. There is, of course, still work to be done, but compared to the past, we have moved mountains. So in terms of moving forward, looking forward, the challenges we face, one of the big ones current right now is the fact that the government over 5.5 years ago promised to ban conversion therapy, the attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Here we are 5.5 years later, and we are still waiting. We've had flip-flops from the government. They were going to do it, then they weren't. Then it was going to be for LGBT people only and not trans. Then it was going to be for everyone. Then it was going to be in the King's speech just recently. Then it wasn't. We have really badly been let down. Everyone knows that all the world's major medical, psychiatric, and counseling organizations say that conversion therapy is unethical, harmful, and ineffective, and that it should go. And already there are 20 more countries that have banned conversion therapy. Why is Britain still lagging behind? It's obvious and easy. We could take the legislation from the Australian state of Victoria, tweak it a little bit, and present it to Parliament next week. It's a template, a model that we could use and adapt, but the government won't do it. So it's a huge, huge, huge betrayal. The other big issue where we've been badly let down is that some years ago, the government consulted publicly on reform of the Gender Recognition Act to propose that trans people should not have to go through lengthy, bureaucratic, medically approved procedures in order to change their legal documents. The result of that public consultation was overwhelmingly in favor of reforming that law. Yet here we are again, all these years later, and the government is making a blanket decision that there will be no changes whatsoever, so that trans people will still have to go through hoops and hurdles in order to change their legal documents. A very lengthy and tiresome procedure, totally unnecessary. Again, we have more than 20 countries or regions of countries that have legislated trans self-ID. And this is a legal process. Some people, the critics say it's just trans people can on a whim say that they're trans and get their legal documents changed. That's not true. They have to sign a statutory declaration, or they would have to sign a statutory declaration in front of a justice of the peace or other legal or professional person to declare that they are trans, And if they falsely made a claim, which later turned out to be untrue, then they could be face very serious penalties. In Scotland, the proposal was 2 years imprisonment for someone making a false declaration. So I think that should reassure people who claim that anybody could just simply, on a whim, declare themselves to be trans and get a change to their legal documents. That, of course, isn't the only issue. Together with conversion therapy, there are others we still face. So, for example, sex and relationship education in our schools is now mandatory, and it is LGBT plus inclusive. But the details and the precise nature of that education is not adequately spelled out in the government guidelines. And many schools do it well, but others just tick boxes. It's a perfunctory, one-off lesson. It doesn't cover all the bases. So we've got to say that for the sake of the health and welfare of young people and their partners, we need better quality relationship and sex education in our schools, and the government guidelines need to be much more explicit and specific so that schools know what they are required to do and the degree to which they need to drill down to all the different dimensions of relationship and sex education, not just about the dangers and risks of sex, such as HIV and other STIs, but also, of course, issues about abusive relationships and sexual abuse by those older and even of the same age. All these issues need to be properly discussed, particularly the issue of consent. And I've always argued that relationship and sex education should be based upon 3 core principles: mutual consent, mutual respect, and mutual fulfillment. If you follow those guidelines in teaching about relationship and sex education, and if young people follow them in their personal relationships and sexual relations, then we will have a much better set of relationships and sex among young people. And of course, also, we need to advise young people that, as well as saying yes to sex, they have a right to say no, and that some people are asexual, and that's perfectly valid as well. Another major issue facing our community is the fact that even today, we still have very problematic Home Office procedures for processing LGBT plus refugees. A majority get refused on their first application. And it's only when they get support from organizations like my own Peter Tatchell Foundation or Rainbow Migrants and others, it's only when they get that support that they're able to do successful appeals, because the procedure required is very complex. And most of these refugees are destitute. They can't afford to pay solicitors. So they have to either do their case themselves or rely on hard-pressed, overworked legal aid solicitors who often don't do a 100% job. We also know that even today, there are still many LGBT plus refugees who get put in asylum detention centers. They haven't committed any crime. In fact, often they've been the victims of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic crime. They've come to Britain to seek a place of refuge, and they're locked up in an asylum detention center where they have no proper access to or easy access to solicitors, to be able to acquire the documents they need to prove their sexual orientation or gender identity, and to get the corroborating evidence that they were jailed or tortured, that they were beaten up, that they were evicted from their homes, that they were subjected to harassment by the police. You can't do that when you're locked up in a detention center. The other issue that those who are not locked up faced is that they are usually put into government Home Office run hostels, many of which are substandard. I've seen some of the conditions. They're absolutely appalling. Now, there are some hostels that are okay, but many are not. They are really squalid. And often these LGBT plus refugees are put together with other refugees who are very homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic. And so they face a lot of harassment and abuse and threats, and even in some cases, physical violence. And I've had to lobby the Home Office to get people out of those abusive hostels. But when you've been a victim of perhaps imprisonment and torture in your home country, and you come here for refuge and you get put in an asylum detention center, where there's also quite a lot of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, sometimes from inmates, but occasionally even from staff. Or if you're in a hostel and you're being victimized in that way, it doubles your trauma. So we have to say that the Home Office has to be much more careful about where they place LGBT plus refugees, so they're not subjected to harassment and victimization. Also, it's very important that we recognize that these refugees who are in these hostels, they are required to live on a state handout of about £40 a week. Now, that is for all their food, clothing, mobile phone, toiletries, transport, everything. No one can live on £40 a week in Britain in 2023. So they're destitute, and many of them depend on handouts and support from churches and other charities. Again, this is just so shocking. What makes it even worse is that many of these refugees have skills that Britain needs. They are doctors, teachers, plumbers, farmers, a whole range of different jobs that we need and that would boost our economy. But the government has ruled that while they live in these hostels, while they're awaiting their asylum application to be cleared, they're not allowed to work. This is madness. It is madness to prevent them from working and force them to live on about £40 a week when they could be not only doing jobs that economically benefit this country, but also be paying tax and national insurance and contributing to the government's coffers. So my foundation has been very much involved in the campaign called Lift the Ban, which says that asylum seekers and refugees should be allowed to work while their asylum claims are being processed. It makes moral sense and it makes economic sense. We also, of course, have made huge changes in public opinion. Back in the late 1980s, more than 2/3 of the British public believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. Now it's down to 16%, a huge, dramatic, and very welcome fall. But that's still nearly 1 in 5 of the British population. That's pretty shocking, again, in the 21st century. We need more work to be done to change hearts and minds, because although we have laws to protect LGBT plus people against discrimination, that doesn't stop people, being unfriendly or unkind to LGBT plus people, making them feel uncomfortable, making them feel unwelcome. We also still have a major problem with anti-LGBT plus hate crime. About 1/3 of all LGBT plus people in the country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime over their lifetime. And for older people, older generations, often they've been victims more than once, perhaps 3, 4, or 5 times. So again, we need to do more to ensure that our streets and workplaces are safe. to ensure that people are not vulnerable to the kind of hate crime that we see. I think many of you will remember the case of the two lesbians badly beaten up on a night bus in London. The case of two gay men leaving a gay club in South London and being beaten up. These things still happen today, and we need to take a stand against that. We need to encourage LGBT plus people to report hate crime to the police, and for the police to take more proactive action to identify hotspots in particular, and to step up patrols and monitoring and surveillance to try and preempt those kinds of attacks. I just want to now look at the situation globally, because there we have a very different picture. Again, it's a picture of progress, but much, much less than here in Britain. So even today, there are still 66 countries that criminalize same-sex relations. More than half of them criminalize both male and female homosexuality. Some of the penalties are just a few years in prison, but some include life imprisonment. Life imprisonment for a same-sex relationship. Unbelievable. There are 11 Muslim majority countries where there is the death penalty for same-sex relations. And in 43 countries, either by explicit legislation or the interpretation of generic legislation, trans people are criminalized. So globally, the picture is much bleaker. But again, we have made huge progress. Nearly 100 countries criminalized same-sex relations 40 years ago. Now it's down to 66. We are winning. We are making those changes, and they're happening right across the globe. From Botswana to Singapore, countries right across the globe are making those changes, and that's a huge tribute to the bravery and determination of LGBT plus people, often battling against quite repressive regimes and unfriendly media, but still undeterred and still winning success. The Commonwealth, of which Britain is a founder and a leading member, is one of the worst offenders. There are 56 Commonwealth member states. 32 of them still criminalize same-sex relations. At least 6 of them still have life imprisonment under colonial era laws that were originally imposed by Britain in the 19th century when it took over and colonized these countries. It is just so shocking. And the Commonwealth Secretariat in London has been very, very slow and very, very underwhelming in its calling out of these countries. The Commonwealth is founded on the principles of human rights. The Commonwealth Charter enshrines those principles. All the member states have signed up to the Commonwealth Charter, yet 32 of them are violating it in extreme ways by criminalizing LGBT plus people. When it comes to the process of change, we're seeing increasingly that while legislators are too cowardly or afraid to end the criminalization of same-sex relations, often it's judges through legal actions that are bringing about those reforms. So we saw in a number of countries in the last 3 or 4 years, courts across the world ruling that LGBT plus criminalization was unconstitutional or in violation of international human rights obligations. So judicial reform has been a key. And of course, in more homophobic countries, that is the way to go, because legislators are so anti-LGBT plus, they're not going to change. But in many of these countries, there are still principled and independent judges who will make those decisions. And as a result, change happens. So very notably, a few years ago, the Indian courts decriminalized same-sex relations. So did the courts in Trinidad and Tobago and Singapore. The process is happening, and we want to pay tribute to those judges who've had the courage to stand against their governments and assert the principle of equal human rights. While I'm on the subject of the Commonwealth, I would just add that the Commonwealth Summit, which takes place every 2 years, has never in more than half a century discussed LGBT plus human rights. In fact, they've vetoed all discussion every time countries have attempted to raise it. That is just so shocking. But nevertheless, we should remember that justice is on our side, that we have a just cause, and that queer freedom is an unstoppable global trend. It may be taking much longer than we hoped. It certainly is, but that is the way it's going. The trend is towards greater liberation of LGBT plus people. So we need to hold on to that hope and recognize that change is possible and that change can and will happen. We just have to keep fighting for it. Maintain our patience, our determination, our resolve and commitment. So finally, I just want to finish by just saying a few words about my own, my own history and so on. I have been campaigning for human rights, including LGBT plus rights, for 56 years. I began age 15 when I was still at school in 1967. Over the last half a century plus, I've been involved in more than 3,000 protests, been arrested 100 times, been subjected to more than 300 violent assaults and 50 attacks upon my home, including a bullet through the front door, arson attacks, and bullets and bricks and bottles through my windows. But I'm still here, and I'm still campaigning. I'm 72 now, or coming up to 72 in January, and intend to carry on at least for another 20 years or more, hopefully with my health holding out. It's been my great honor and privilege to be part of this movement. I've seen so many fantastic changes in my lifetime. Now, some of you may have seen the Netflix documentary about my campaigns. It's called Hating Peter Tatchell. It was produced by the director, Christopher Amos. He came up with the title because he was so shocked when he started to do the research for the film about the level of hatred, vitriol, death threats, and so on that I'd been receiving over decades. So that's why he came up with the title, Hating Peter Tatchell. It's his film, not mine. I just collaborated with him to give him pointers on how to find archive material and to point him to people to interview. But it's his film, and I had no control over it. He had total editorial independence. But the reason I collaborated was because I wanted to show people through my campaigns that social change is possible, to give people ideas and tips on how to be change makers. And so I'm hoping that people who watch that film will be inspired and motivated to be activists themselves. Perhaps not in the often extreme ways I've done it, like trying to arrest the Zimbabwean president, Robert Mugabe, not once, but twice, and getting beaten up very badly as a consequence. But, in your own way, I want that film to help inspire a new generation of change makers. So on that note, I will finish and thank you for the honor of being invited to speak to you today.